Afternoon, everyone. Today's installment will be about the German and Axis forces invasion of the USSR and why, on paper, they thought they could win. Um, just going to look at the forces in Europe and the African theaters. This will be part one of the series, Frontier Battles. Some ground rules. These are just my thoughts, of course. Comment in the comment section, like, share, subscribe. Let's get started. We're going to first look at the German Army overall ground forces. They had 5 army groups, 14 army headquarters, 4 panzer group headquarters, 48 corps headquarters, 12 panzer corps headquarters. That include 21 armored, 14 motorized infantry, 1 cavalry, 177 infantry, and 10 security divisions for a total of 224 divisions. They had almost 3,800 tanks. It was a good mix of their Panzer fours, Panzer threes with the 50 millimeters, and Panzer three with the 37 millimeters. But they also still had a lot of Panzer one, two, and twos. They had a lot of checkmate Panzer 38 Ts and 35 Ts. Now, this entire army wasn't fighting on the Eastern Front. By 1941, Germany had pretty much conquered most of Europe or controlled it outright. On the Western Front, for garrison duty in Norway, France, the Low Countries, Denmark, they had a total of 1 army group, 4 army headquarters, 11 corps, and 49 total infantry divisions. The reason they had these forces here was, like I said, to garrison, but also another reason that's usually overlooked in history, the terrible logistics of Nazi Germany. They just didn't have the capability to feed these soldiers in Germany itself or anywhere else. They garrisoned them in France. They garrisoned them in these countries, not just to defend and stop suppressed locals, but also to feed these guys. By this time in 1941, the German mismanagement had really taken hold not only in Germany but in all of Europe. There was starting to be food shortages, industrial shortages, and just overall shortages across Europe. Germany at this point was breaking down industry and equipment and ship it in all these conquered places and shipping it back to Germany. Same thing with slave labor. But even with these, they still had production issues, and because they were taking all this equipment, it it stopped the local nations from being able to move farm goods from the farms to the urban areas. Plus, the huge German military in these areas taking a lot of the food. All these disruptions in Greece, there was a famine. Parts of France, milk was going bad. People weren't eating as well. Yugoslavia, the Netherlands, all these places, there were just shortages everywhere. The real mismanagement, abuse of the German regime. In the Balkans, the German army had 7 infantry divisions, 1 army group, 1 army headquarters, same leadership, 2 corps. In Africa itself, they had 1 panzer corps headquarters, 2 armored, and 1 infantry division forming for a total of 3 divisions. In Germany, they had 1 corps, 1 panzer corps, 2 armored divisions that were being formed, 1 motorized division, 8 infantry divisions for a total of 11 divisions. On the Eastern Front itself, this is where they had the bulk of their army. They had 3 army group headquarters, 8 armies, 30 corps, and 10 panzer corps. Now, the bulk of that, as you can tell, the bulk of their forces, they had 17 armored divisions, 13 motorized divisions, 1 cavalry division, 91 infantry division, 9 security divisions for a total of 131 divisions ready to strike against the Soviets. Directly behind them in the reserves, these forces would come in early July to fight in the frontier battles. Another army, 4 corps, 20 infantry, 1 security division for an additional 21 divisions. Overall, this force up to this point had fought in 6 campaigns, conquered roughly 13 nations. They understood their craft. They've been fighting in the same style of warfare, the war of movement, since the 14th century. Only thing changed between now and the armies of Frederick the Great was, instead of just having infantry, artillery, and cavalry, they now had infantry, artillery, armor, planes, and radios. But it was basically the same style of fighting. Up front, short and lively wars. The opening part of their campaigns, well planned and executed. Their plan was to attack the Soviets, destroy their frontier forces, dice up their second line, and then race to the arbitrary line they set up, conquer it, take over, move people in, strip it of resources, become overlords, and then demobilize forces. It's not what happened, but that's what their plan was. Let's look at their allied forces now. The European Axis ground forces, made up of Italy, Romania, Finland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovak, and Croatian forces. I call them Axis allies, but in reality, they really weren't allies. They were more nations that have been bullied or forced into some type of agreement with Nazi Germany. Better to be on their side at this point than to be conquered by them. It was like the movie State Property said, you can either get down or you can lay down. And they decided to get down. Overall, the total ground forces, they had 3 army groups, 19 army headquarters, 4 armored divisions, 3 motorized infantry divisions, 131 infantry divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, for a total of 141 divisions. So as you can tell, you add this to the German forces, now you're looking at a force at 365 total divisions, which actually outnumbered the Soviet Union and Great Britain's ground forces in the European theater. Another reason why they thought they could win. Overall, they had an additional 700 tanks, mostly Italian tanks, weren't that good. Their forces on the Eastern Front, since we're focusing on that, they had one army group, a Romanian one, 3 army headquarters, 16 Finnish infantry, 2 Slovak infantry, 1 Romanian armored, 1 Romanian cavalry, 16 Romanian infantry, for a total of 36 divisions. They had 172 tanks. On the Western Front, they had 1 army headquarters, 6 Italian divisions. And in Africa, they had 1 army group headquarters, Italian, 1 army. These are all Italian forces. 1 armored, 2 motorized infantry, 4 infantry, for a total of 7 infantry divisions of 320 tanks. In the Balkans, they had another army group headquarters, Italian, 5 army headquarters, 28 infantry divisions, 28 Italian infantry divisions, 8 Bulgarian infantry divisions, 1 Bulgarian cavalry division, for a total of 37 divisions. At home, in their home country, they had 9 army headquarters, of which the Italians had 2 armored, 1 motorized, and 14 infantry. The Croatians had their entire army, 5 infantry divisions. The Romanians had another 12 infantry divisions. Bulgaria had 11. The Hungarians had 9, for a total of 54 divisions of just sitting at home not doing anything. So with this, and 211 some tanks. What this goes to show is the fact that the Axis allies never really had unity of command, an understanding of an overall goal of what they wanted to do as a group. No joint plan, and the Germans didn't even tell them that they were getting ready to invade the Soviets for like maybe 2 weeks, a week, sometimes days before they happened. And then Hitler himself pitted some of these nations against each other. The Romanians and the Hungarians had ancient beef, and Hitler played on it. So the Romanians couldn't mass their entire army against the Soviets because they had to leave troops along the border in case Hungary did something. The Bulgarians didn't want to send troops anywhere. They barely sent troops into Yugoslavia. Italy and Germany were beefing over issues in the Balkans. The Croatians were just a puppet state that was barely holding on. And then the logistics and industrial capabilities of all these nations was terrible. Italy was mismanaged. The rest were just feeble and weak. And like I said, They didn't have the logistical capabilities. Even if they wanted to send more troops into Russia, they couldn't. Overall, the Nazis' allies were a weak, disjointed force. Had some good leadership. The soldiers fought better than what people give them a lot of credit for. The equipment wasn't great, but they didn't start off with a lot. In spite of all, like I said, in spite of all the different handicaps they had, the Axis Allied forces themselves weren't really bad. Their units really weren't as bad as it portrayed. The Germans just used them as an excuse of why they lost. In reality, the Germans brought it on themselves. Next up, we'll look at the USSR itself, the Soviet forces. On paper, the world's largest ground force. But that hides a lot of deficiencies. They had a total of 310 divisions. They had almost 15,000 tanks. But most of their tanks were hopeless tanks that had no chance of surviving on the battlefield. Out of their 15,000 tanks, 10,000 of them were I should actually say almost 13,000 were hopeless. That were either BT or T-26 tanks, completely outclassed and ripe for the picking. The Germans also knew that they had the T-28, well armored, a large gun, but the way the tank was designed and some other issues with the tank made it a pretty poor tank. The Germans really didn't know the T-34 and KV existed, so by their reckoning, the Soviet Union had about 13,000 tanks, and they thought they completely outclassed them. Not just the tanks, but that's because of the experience of their soldiers. They knew that they had better tankers, and their way of war would destroy them because the infantry anti-tank guns would be able to knock these tanks out. Now, they also knew that even though on paper the Soviets had the world's largest army, all those forces weren't on the border. They knew that the Soviets had huge forces in Central Asia and the Far East. In those two areas alone, they had one front headquarters, 2 military districts, 5 army headquarters, 7 rifle corps, 1 cavalry corps, 2 motorized corps, for a total of 31 infantry, 4 cavalry, 7 armored, 4 motorized infantry, or 46 divisions that would take months to get to the Western Front. They also had another 2,300 tanks, all BT and T-26 tanks, so they weren't really worried about that force. On the frontier itself, the Soviets only had 5 front headquarters, 15 army, 32 rifle corps, 3 airborne corps, 3 cavalry corps, 19 motorized corps, for a total of 42 armored, 20 motorized infantry, 98 infantry, 3 cavalry, 7 cavalry, for a total of 170 total divisions. They had over 10,000 tanks, but once again, the bulk of those tanks were hopeless and poor tanks. They still had around 1,500 KV and T-34 tanks, which is a huge amount, but they were spread throughout their 62 armored and motorized divisions. Some of these units were being rebuilt, so some units had more tanks. Almost all the units themselves had a lack of ammunition, a lack of training, a lack of parts, a lack of support vehicles, a lack of everything. So all these lacks made this huge mechanized force pretty much useless. The disposition of the frontier forces also played into the Axis hands. The way they had their forces forward deployed, and some crazy deployments, which left their flanks open in a lot of places and didn't allow for them to mutually support each other. The second level forces, these are the forces that pretty much fought in August and beyond. Of course, they had the Stuka reserves, 6 army headquarters, 14 corps, 5 5 motorized corps for a total of 10 armored, 5 motorized infantry, 42 infantry, 57 total divisions. They had over 3,800 tanks, but once again, it was mostly made up of BT and T-30 and T-26s. They also had an additional in the second level. They had 7 military districts that fell in this area, 1 additional Army headquarters, which consisted of 8 rifle corps, 2 airborne corps, 2 motorized corps, an additional 4 armored, 2 motorized infantry, 31 rifle infantry, 2 airborne, 3 cavalry, 54 divisions, and another 1,300 tanks. So all told, their second level had an additional 109 divisions, which they expected they were gonna have to fight, but the Axis plan was knock out most of the 170. The few that do survive would link up with the 109 divisions, and then they would defeat them in detail also. What the Germans didn't realize was how centralized the Soviet leadership and country was, and how industrialized it was, and they just didn't think that the Soviet leadership would be able to withstand such losses. They thought that the people themselves would demoralize and didn't like Bolsheviks and would rise up. But the Nazis themselves, brutality stopped all that, and the people kind of gravitated to the devil they knew instead of the devil they didn't know. And like I said, I give the Soviets, for as bad, corrupt, and unorganized they still were able to be organized enough to massively raise troops, massively move production, massively just build stuff. They dumbed it down and just built it easy. And like I said, the Germans just didn't know about the T-34 and KV. And then once the Soviets realized how simple it was to make and how effective these weapons were, they just mass produced them. Next up, the Soviets' only real ally, the UK. We're only going to look at their forces in the UK, North Africa, and the Middle East. In the UK itself, they had 20 divisions, 6 armored, 14 infantry. They had no way of invading France or Norway. So these 20 divisions held down basically 54 Axis divisions, which could have been used against the Soviets, but they kept them there, like I said, for logistical reasons, and because they were, I guess, some reason they thought Great Britain would invade France in 1941 with no logistical support by themselves. In North Africa, they had an additional 7 divisions, 1 armored, 1 infantry, 5 Commonwealth infantry versus 10 Axis divisions again at this point. In the Middle East, which could support the North Africa, they had 1 cavalry, 1 infantry, 3 Commonwealth infantry for an additional 5. Grand total, 7 armored, 1 cavalry, 16 infantry, 8 Commonwealth, 32 divisions. But they can't, other than North Africa, these forces couldn't support the Soviets. So the Soviets were basically on their own. First up, we'll look at the Army Group North versus the Northwest Front itself. Army Group North, as you can see on the little map that I've put up, was basically poised and attack, massed in a small area. Had a high ratio of forces for a small frontage, so they were definitely ready for offensive operations. It consisted of 2 Army headquarters, 1 Panzer Group headquarters, 6 corps, 2 motorized corps, for a total of 3 armored, 3 motorized infantry, 20 infantry, 3 security for a total of 29 divisions. They had 602 total tanks. They had a lot of Czech tanks. Had 270 some Czech-built tanks, and another 150 Panzer IV, Panzer III tanks with the 50 millimeters. In reserve, they had 1 corps and 2 infantry division versus the Northwest Front. Now, the Northwest Front, on paper, if you count the total forces on the front, they had 20 divisions, which means they were outnumbered, but they had an additional 6 divisions with 27th Army, but they had no way of actually moving to the front. This force was strictly infantry, lacked transportation support, so they had no real way of supporting the two frontier armies. The frontier armies themselves consisted of the 8th Army in the north, 11th Army in the south. The 8th Army had two rifle corps, 1 motorized corps, 2 armored divisions, 1 motorized division, 5 rifle divisions. The 11th also had 2 rifle corps, 1 motorized corps, 2 armored divisions, 1 motorized division, 8 infantry divisions, and the front itself controlled an additional rifle corps that had no forces under it, an airborne corps, 1 airborne division. They had a total of 1,400 tanks, of which only 100 and some were either KV or T-34. The rest were just useless light tanks. They reserved. Now, what happened here was, of course, the Army Group North's forces completely ran through the 8th and 11th Division, forcing them to fall back and basically flee. They tried to counterattack with both their motorized corps, which, because they had more than 1,300 light tanks, hopeless tanks, the Germans were at war with their anti-tank guns, their tankers, their air support, and their artillery just completely overwhelmed them. The 2 corps themselves didn't have all the ammunition, didn't really train on the equipment, didn't have fuel, terrible leadership, didn't attack piecemeal, so they were destroyed in detail. And once their armored force was gone, the infantry was just on its own. The infantry had to fall back to the next river line where it met up with the 27th Army, and then this force, the staff cut itself to take forces from the northern front, 2 motorized corps, which consisted of, and some additional forces, 5 armored, 2 motorized, and 2 rifle divisions for an additional 9 divisions, plus what was left over from the 8th and 11th Division to set up a new defense line. But with an additional 1,300 mostly light tanks. This force on the frontier was completely overwhelmed in the opening days. Not even the 11th Army, one of its corps, two infantry divisions, didn't even fight against Army Group North. They fought against Army Group Center, so they were really outnumbered. His force was just completely overrun. The only reason they didn't even advance even farther, which was still an amazing advance, swamps, rivers, and forest. But by the 30th, they had already advanced to the Rager line, where the 27th Army was waiting. Next up, we're going to look at Army Group Center versus the Western Front. Once again, the notion that the Germans fought against these huge Russian forces and were completely outnumbered at the local level almost continuously throughout the frontier battles. The Germans actually outnumbered the Soviets at the point of attack. Army Group Center itself consisted of 2 armies and 2 panzer groups. The 3rd Panzer Group in the north, 9th Army south of that, the 4th Army south of that, and the 2nd Panzer Group south of that. The Army Group Reserve was the 13th Corps with 1 infantry division. Grand total, it had 1 Army Group headquarters, 2 armies, 2 panzer groups, 10 corps, 5 motorized corps for 9 armored, 6 motorized infantry, 28 infantry, 3 security divisions, 46 divisions. In their reserves, they had the 2nd Army itself that was pulling up. They had an additional 2 corps, 9 infantry, 1 security division for a total of 10 divisions. So throughout the frontier battles, they would have 56 total divisions. They had over 1,700 tanks, more than 590 Panzer IV and Panzer IIIs with the 50 millimeters, and another 160 Panzer IIIs with the 37 millimeters. So this force had a lot of really good tanks. They still consist of a lot of 400 Panzer 1 and 2s, which at this point were pretty much useless except for fighting the light tanks. Versus them was the Western Front itself, which their disposition, with the way they had the 3rd and the 10th Army, and then with the 4th Army way down to the south, was just crazy. It was ripe to be flanked, and that's what happened. Like I said, it was made up of the 3rd, 10th, and 4th armies. It also had the 13th Army in reserve, but it had no units. For it had a grand total of 8 rifle corps, 1 airborne corps, 1 cavalry corps, 6 motorized corps, 12 armored divisions, 6 motorized infantry divisions, 23 infantry divisions, 5 airborne divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, for a total of 45 divisions. So as you can see, initially they were slightly outnumbered, but the Germans were able to bring their 10 divisions up, which made them a little bit more outnumbered. And like I said, the way the disposition really hurt them. They had the 4th Army versus the 2nd Panzer Division. The 2nd Panzer Group. Gagarin's forces pretty much just sliced through them. Gagarin's Panzer Group at that point had more infantry than the 4th Army did itself, and it had more tank and motorized divisions. And then you had the 10th and the 3rd Army. The way they were situated, once the 2nd Panzer just brushed aside the 4th Army, that and the German 4th Army itself completely outflanked the 10th and the 3rd Army's southern flank. And then Holt's 3rd Panzer Group sliced right through the 3rd Army, surrounding them from the north. And just like that, the 10th and the 3rd Army were completely surrounded. Plus, most of the frontier forces, which counterattacked forward, were also surrounded. It didn't take long for Army Group Center to destroy these forces on the frontier. The only thing that took a long time was the Soviets didn't quit once they were surrounded, so it took the infantry armies time to pound them and capture and pound the remainders into dust. But it's pretty much inevitable. German tactics here had huge gains on paper. It's bad. Next up, Army Group South versus the Southwest Front. Now here, this is one of the few places where the Germans were actually really outnumbered. The Southwest Front, the terrain itself helped the Southwest Front. You had the swamps to the north, which were almost impassable. You had the Carpathian Mountains to the south, so there was only a small area in between where the Germans had to push through, and they didn't have a lot of maneuver space. They would have to punch through to get into the Ukraine proper itself. Then they'd have plenty of ability to maneuver. But at first, on the frontier battle, that and all the rivers was a defensive force's dream. Army Group South itself consisted of the 6th Army, the 1st Panzer Group, the 17th Army, and the forces the Army Group controlled itself. Its reserve consisted of 2 additional corps with a total of 9 infantry divisions. The grand total forces up front was 1 Army Group headquarters, 2 armies, 1 Panzer Group, 7 corps, 3 motorized corps, 1 Slovak mobile corps, 5 armored, 4 motorized infantry, 23 infantry, 2 Slovak infantry, 3 security, for a total of 37 divisions, not counting their reserves. So once you count the reserves, that took them up to 46 total divisions. They had total almost a little less than 1,000 tanks. About 600 of them were Panzer IV, Panzer III with the 50 millimeters. Another 100 were Panzer III with the 37 millimeters. The rest of their forces were either Panzer II, Panzer Is, or command tanks. Versus the Southwest Front. The Southwest Front had a total of 57 divisions, which still, like I said, their disposition, they were deployed in an echelon defense in depth. Like I said, the terrain favored the defense. They had a huge tank force, yes, 4,311 some tanks, and yes, more than 3,300 were either poor T-28 or hopeless BT or T-26 tanks, but they still had over 900 KV and T-34 tanks, which would actually help slow down Army Group South's advance. Um, their forces consisted of the 5th Army, 6th Army, 26th Army, 12th Army. The front controlled 4 rifle corps, 1 airborne corps, 2 motorized corps. Yeah, most of these armies were echeloned in depth. Like I said, once they were surprise attacked, they automatically went over to the offense, which slowed down the German advance because the Axis basically had to just smash their way through them. The world's largest tank battle was fought here. Actually, we're gonna do a video on that. And it was the world's largest tank battle. It doesn't get a lot of press, but the same things that kind of hurt the Soviets in other places hurt them here. Wooden leadership capabilities, inflexible orders, lack of coordination, lack of ammunition, lack of fuel, lack of training, lack of support forces. Some of the armored and motorized forces themselves didn't have transportation trucks, didn't have ammo trucks, didn't have a way of actually moving their attached infantry with them. So the tanks just went off by themselves. Didn't have ammo, or had the right ammo. So the Germans pretty much just swacked them. But because there were so many of them, and because of the terrain and the defense, it took a long time. This front lasted longer than any other front because of its size and because of the terrain. But in the end, they still got swacked. Next up, we're going to look at the Romanian army group. It consisted of three armies, 2 Romanians, 1 German. The 3rd Romanian, the 11th German army, and the 4th Romanian army. They had a grand total of 1 army group, 1 German army. Like I said, 2 Romanian armies, 4 German corps, 6 Romanian corps, 1 Romanian cavalry corps, 7 German infantry divisions, 1 Romanian armored division, 1 Romanian cavalry division, 16 Romanian infantry divisions for a total of 25 divisions. They had 138 tanks, half Czech made, half French made. The tanks were pretty average tanks. Like I said, the Romanians get a bad rap, but they actually fought pretty well, were led pretty well. They didn't have the greatest equipment. And this army group, the Romanian army group, fought against the Southern Front. They didn't attack initially on June 22nd. They started their attack July 1st. But I mean, because of this, the Southern Front itself knew that they were getting ready to be attacked. So the Romanians and the German forces here didn't have surprise on their side. They actually fought against an enemy force that was ready, and because once again terrain with all the rivers, should on paper have fought well, and they did. But the Romanians and the 11th Army itself proved its mettle. The Southern Front itself consisted basically of the 9th Army. It had 3 rifle corps, 1 cavalry corps, 2 motorized corps, a total of 8 infantry, 2 cavalry, 4 armored, 2 motorized, for a total of 16 divisions. They were outnumbered, but because of the terrain and they knew the attack was coming, they fought a good defense. But the Romanians and 11th Army just eventually obliterated them. They had a total of 799 tanks, greatly outnumbering the Axis tank force. They had 60 KV and T-34s, which were better than all of the Romanian tanks. But like I said, the bulk of the Romanians fought through it. They did have a reserve, the 18th Army, but it didn't have any forces under it. But they raised forces, and the forces that fell back were able to form an army out of it. The Romanian army group itself, once it smashed through, was able to take Odessa and help put the noose around the forces that gathered around Ulm. Overall, this army group did really well. I'm impressed, as history should be impressed, but we usually just think of Romanians as terrible soldiers. Now we'll talk about the last front that people never talk about when they talk about the Eastern Front, and that's the Axis Arctic Front versus the Northern Front. During the frontier battles, The Axis Arctic Front consisted of Army Norway Forward, which was part of Army Norway. It had two German corps, one Finnish corps, one motorized infantry, three German infantry, and two Finnish infantry for a total of 6 divisions. There was a Finnish army. They had 4 Finnish corps, one German division, 14 Finnish divisions for a total of 15 divisions. Grand total, of course, they had 21 total divisions, 54 tanks, versus the Northern Front, which had 1,500 tanks. Almost all 1,500 of them were light tanks, which were hopeless. But still, that's 1,500 tanks. It consisted of 3 armies for a total of 3 rifle corps, 2 motorized corps, 6 armored divisions, 2 motorized infantry, 15 divisions for a total of 23 divisions. So they outnumbered the Axis forces itself. But the Axis forces themselves, because one, Hitler didn't inform them in a timely manner that he was going to invade and when he was actually going to do the invasion. And the Finnish forces weren't ready for some reason. And it took the Axis forces a while to get their divisions in. And they could have sent more divisions, but because of logistical reasons and the fear of Britain invading, I guess, Norway, they didn't send as many forces as they could. So when they finally did attack, there was really only 14 Northern Front divisions left, only 1 armored division, and 13 infantry divisions. Because by the time they attacked, the Northern Front had to send 5 armored, 2 motorized infantry divisions, a total of 9 divisions, to try to save the crumbling Northwest Front. They also took more than 1,300 of their 1,500 tanks. So they basically left them with no tanks, no forces, and yet this front did the best. The weather itself and the lack of logistic capabilities, the Finns not really wanting to do much. They just wanted to take their territory back. They really didn't, like I said before, the Axis really didn't have a centralized, overarching plan. So they just wanted to take, the Finns just wanted to take their lost territory back, maybe a little extra, and then just the poor performance of the German forces itself. The German forces themselves, they attacked and really didn't do anything. Between 1941 and 1943, they really didn't advance. This was the worst showing of the German forces in 1941 across the entire. I mean, as much as they talk about the Romanians, these German forces here were the worst. They didn't take Murmansk. They didn't cut the rail line. It allowed the Soviets to continue once Lend-Lease started to use this. Because they didn't take this, they weren't, and because of Finland, they weren't able to take Leningrad, which just like a vortex just sucked German forces into it, which they could have used Leningrad to ship supplies, and if they had took it, they probably would have freed up a whole another army, maybe 2, that they could have used somewhere else in 1942. But because they didn't, you know how history ended. The German forces here just were terrible. I gotta blame it on the forces. I gotta blame it on leadership at every level. They just didn't perform. The frontier forces themselves, from June 22nd to July 31st, you had 3,500 total German tanks, of which 1,300 were Panzer III with the 50 mil and Panzer IV tanks. They also had another 261 Panzer III tanks with the 37 inch, which used probably were a match for the early T-34 tanks, because the early T-34 tanks weren't the later versions. So the optics on them lent to it. They still had problems penetrating armor, but if you maneuvered them right, which the Germans did, and because of air support and other factors, they neutralized. They could they couldn't really neutralize it. They could negate the superiority of the T-34. Total forces for the Axis and the frontier battles itself was, like I said, 3 German army groups, 1 Romanian army group for a total of 4 army groups, 8 German army, 4 Panzer Group armies, 2 Romanian armies, 1 Finnish army, for a total of 15 armies. That consisted of 3 German corps, 10 motorized corps, 6 Romanian corps, 1 Romanian cavalry corps, 5 Finnish corps, 1 Slovak mobile corps, for a total of 53 total corps. They had a total of 17 German armored divisions, 13 motorized infantry divisions, 1 German cavalry division, 91 infantry divisions, 9 security divisions, 1 Romanian armored division, 1 Romanian cavalry division, 16 Romanian infantry divisions, and another 16 Finnish infantry divisions, 2 Slovak infantry divisions, for a total of 167 divisions. And you add that with their reserve, with that additional army, and those 4 additional corps, plus the 20 infantry and 1 security, another 21 divisions. So during the frontier battles itself, the Germans had 188 total divisions versus only 170 Soviet divisions. Yes, they had 42 armored divisions and 20 motorized infantry divisions, which on paper was huge because they had over 10,000 tanks. But once again, more than 8,400 of those tanks were hopeless tanks, BT and T-26s, plus an additional 500 T-28. They still had a lot of T-34s and KVs, more than 1,500 of them. But if you count the German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, they had 1,300 of them. So they really didn't have a huge numerical advantage as far as their top line tanks. In summary, even though the myths go, the Germans in the frontier battle fought against this huge force, that they were outnumbered and all these other things. In reality, they, at the point of attack, other than the Army Group South versus the Southwest Front, they pretty much outnumbered the Soviets throughout the frontier forces. The disposition of their forces, the leadership problems, the logistical problems, which at that point was worse than the German logistical problems. The Air Force was completely destroyed. For the most part, they were surprised. The Germans just had all the advantages. The myth that they fought against this huge force at first, the Germans outnumbered the Soviet forces till sometime in 1942. But 1941, throughout that whole campaign and Operation Typhoon, they outnumbered them. Even during the counterattack in front of Moscow, they outnumbered them. But the Germans try to rewrite history like they were outnumbered the whole time, and the only tanks that the Soviets had were T-34s and KVs, and that's not the truth. It was just, but now that we're looking more and more at history and actually looking at history, not just through the German eyes, we're seeing that, yes, the German army did really well, but it's not what they claimed it to be. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Army Life Old Man Fat Boy Style. The references I used, Tick himself, the Imperial Knight. He's got a great YouTube page. If you're really looking for an in-depth page about the Eastern Front itself or just history, he's got a great page. It's really in-depth. Really, I recommend his page to everyone, especially if you want to think about the logistical part of World War II. I like to thank the people at OperationBarbarossa.net for all their help with the information. Same thing with AccessHistory.com. I can't pronounce the last link. That website hasn't really been updated in a while, but it still has great information. If you've never read a David Glantz or Robert Citino book, you're really missing out. You really don't really know about the history of the Eastern Front. David Glantz, Robert Citino, a whole depth and breadth of knowledge on the Eastern Front, written more of a perspective of what actually happened with the Germans, and now that the archives have been opened up, what was really going on with the Soviets itself. It's no longer just a one-sided debate, and they go really into depth of how the Soviets' counterattacks were effective sometimes. A lot of times they weren't, and it just wasn't madman stuff. It was actually some thought to it. It didn't always work out, but they were basically prepping for the deep battle, and eventually they beat the Germans in conventional warfare by themselves. It took a lot, but they won. Same thing with Chris Bishop's. His books are well written also and great illustration. I'd like to thank everyone again. Guys, have a great day.